January 22, 2022, 11:53 a.m. Hayden Yampa Valley Airport, Colorado. Clear skies, calm winds, perfect visibility. A JetBlue Airbus A320 accelerates down runway 10, 80 knots, 100 knots, 118 knots. When suddenly the co-pilot shouts, "He's on the 28, is that him?" Oh shit! On the other side of the same runway, coming in completely opposite direction, a King Air is less than 4 miles on final for landing. 2 aircraft, 1 runway, opposite directions. The captain has less than 15 seconds to decide what to do before a head-on collision occurs in mid-air. How the hell is it possible that 2 professional pilots, on a clear sky day with radio communication working perfectly, don't realize they're taking off straight toward another aircraft? Who made the fatal mistake? Why did the captain pull the stick 24 knots before rotation speed? And the most terrifying thing of all, how many times has this happened without anyone knowing? This is another story about warning signs that were there clear as day, but were completely ignored because of something happening inside our own heads. I'm Captain Sergio Marchetti, commercial pilot with over 25 years in aviation. What you're about to watch now isn't a dramatized reconstruction. It's the real story told from the point of view of someone who spent thousands of hours in the cockpit and knows exactly what goes through a pilot's head when everything goes wrong. Welcome aboard, my co-pilot. Let's understand first where this story happens because the airport details are absolutely crucial here. Hayden Yampa Valley is located on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, surrounded by beautiful natural parks and peaks reaching over 16,000 feet. Because of this, the airport itself sits quite high, at 6,607 feet above sea level to be exact. And this means that the minimum off-route altitude, what we call MORA, reaches an incredible 16,600 feet to the east. Keep this information in mind because it's going to be important later. Now here's the first big problem. Hayden Yampa Valley has no control tower. Let me be crystal clear about what this means. Without a tower, there's nobody looking out the window seeing what's happening on the runway. There's nobody giving landing or takeoff clearance. There's no voice on the radio saying cleared to land runway 10 or hold position. What do they have? A common frequency called CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, where pilots announce their intentions to each other. It's like a WhatsApp group, where everyone says what they're going to do and hopes everyone else is paying attention. Sometimes there's a Unicom operator who can give information about wind and traffic. But this guy has no control function whatsoever. He can't order you to do anything. To make matters worse, commercial aircraft flying IFR flight plans need to communicate with Denver Control Center on a separate frequency to get route clearances. So imagine, you have to keep one radio tuned to the local CTAF frequency listening to where everyone is, and another radio tuned to Denver to get your clearances. Getting confusing? Yeah, I think so too. And look, I understand this working well at a little general aviation airport with half a dozen Cessnas flying per day. But Hayden Yampa Valley wasn't that. In the 12 months prior to this day, the airport had registered 2,100 commercial airliner operations, 3,955 air taxi flights, and 5,413 general aviation movements. That's 11,468 movements total, an average of 30 per day, my friend. Among these operations were seasonal JetBlue flights, and on January 22nd, they had operated a morning flight coming from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, bringing 2 pilots who were on rest, what we call dead head. These 2 pilots were going to operate the return flight to Florida. The captain was 45 years old with 13 years at JetBlue. He was rated to fly several aircraft types, ERJ-170, 190, and the Airbus A320, which was exactly the aircraft they were about to operate now. Total experience? 11,600 flight hours. Pretty much the same experience I have, actually. We don't know exactly how many of those hours were on the A320 specifically, but what we do know is that he was well rested and had flown only 44 hours in the last 30 days. Pretty civilized. The co-pilot, first officer, was 40 years old with 8 years at JetBlue. Total of 3,307 flight hours. Similar ratings to the captain. Neither of them had a history of accidents or incidents. Training records? The report doesn't even mention them, which generally means everything was fine. Now pay attention to this. JetBlue knew that Hayden was a tricky airport, so much so that they had created a special briefing just for it. You know what it said? Very high minimum altitude, dangerous mountainous terrain, high density altitude. And listen to this carefully, frequent use of opposing runways, high traffic volume and absence of control tower. The briefing told pilots to stay alert on the CTAF frequency, make proper traffic calls, and call the Unicom operator 10 minutes before departure. And there was more. It said that runway 10 was used primarily for landings, even with tailwinds up to 10 knots. So these pilots knew, or at least should have known, that this airport was different. The flight plan to Fort Lauderdale was straightforward, nothing special. The weather was also excellent. It had snowed overnight, but now the sky was clearing, leaving only a few small clouds at 500 feet. Cold, but good visibility. After arriving, the two pilots entered the cockpit and began preparing everything for the return flight. The captain was going to be the pilot flying, the PF. While he configured the cockpit, the co-pilot went out to do the external inspection of the aircraft. The aircraft was a beautiful 12-year-old Airbus A320 with no technical defects recorded. It was fueled according to the flight plan, and with the weight of 102 passengers and 6 crew members, the calculated takeoff weight came to 145,782 pounds, 1,800 pounds below the maximum allowed for runway 10. With that weight, the takeoff speeds came out as follows. V1 decision speed 142 knots, VR rotation speed 142 knots, and V2 safe climb speed with one engine 143 knots. Memorize these numbers. 142, 142, 143. While the JetBlue crew prepared the Airbus, another aircraft was approaching Hayden. It was a 28-year-old Beechcraft King Air B300, registration N350J, piloted by a guy and his wife. We don't know much about his age and experience, but honestly this isn't going to matter much for what's about to happen. He was flying on an IFR flight plan and had just started his descent coming from the east, intending to do an ILS approach for runway 10, the same runway JetBlue was going to use for takeoff. 11:45 am. Boarding of JetBlue Flight 1748 is complete. The flight attendants close the doors. 108 people on board, passengers and crew. In the cockpit, the two pilots finish preparation and begin the before engine start checklist. 11:48 am. As soon as the doors close, the co-pilot calls on the CTAF frequency. Hayden traffic, JetBlue 1748 will be pushing back now and will soon be taxiing to runway 10 for departure. No one responds, but 5 seconds later, 11:48:05. The King Air calls, Hayden Yampa Valley, King Air 350. Juliet, we're about 9 minutes from the 10 coming from the east, descending out of 17,350, Juliet. The Unicom operator responds, 350 Juliet, multiple aircraft inbound, winds calm, altimeter 30.36. King Air, altimeter 30.36, 350 Juliet. In the JetBlue cockpit, the two pilots discuss that last call, especially the part about multiple aircraft inbound. Then the co-pilot calls Denver Center. Denver, JetBlue 1748 still on the ground at Hayden. We're going to start engines now. We'll be ready for departure in about 6 to 7 minutes. Denver responds, JetBlue 1748, confirm runway 10? Affirmative, runway 10. Okay, call me when you're at the runway holding point number 1 and ready to go. Then I'll pass the clearance. Understood, JetBlue 1748. 30 seconds later, the aircraft begins pushback and starts the first engine. Meanwhile, the King Air tries to call Denver, but gets no response. At JetBlue, the second engine is being started. The King Air tries again, Denver, King Air 350 Juliet. This time, the controller responds. King Air, is it possible for me to cancel IFR and proceed visual direct to 28? I can already see the runway. Pay attention to this part here, because it's super important. The King Air pilot just decided to change runways. He was coming for 10, but now he saw he can go visual direct to 28, which is the opposite runway. Denver, it's up to you to cancel IFR. Your decision. King Air, okay, cancelling IFR then, I'll proceed visual to 28. Denver, Roger, free to change frequency. Do you understand what just happened? The King Air completely changed the plan. He's no longer coming to runway 10. Now he's coming to 28, the other side. But you know who didn't hear this? The JetBlue pilots. Because this entire conversation happened on the Denver frequency, while they were busy starting the second engine and doing the after-start checklist. The Denver frequency was full of other calls too, so the chance of them paying special attention to some random call from a King Air was practically zero. 11:43:07. Now the King Air calls on the CTAF frequency, the one JetBlue should be monitoring. 350 Juliet, going to go ahead and land 28, Hayden Yampa Valley. We're straight in 28 right now. This call the JetBlue pilots should have heard, but at this moment they're preparing to taxi. Looking outside, making sure ground personnel cleared the area, preparing to navigate on the ground. So it's possible they missed this one too. And there's another detail here. Look at how the King Air spoke. Going to land 28. He didn't say runway 28 or runway 28, just said 28. It might seem silly, but listen, correct phraseology is super important for us. Certain words work as triggers in our heads. When someone clearly says runway 28, that catches attention in a different way. I know I operate little in the United States, but I've already noticed that phraseology there tends to be more relaxed, more informal. Words like runway or complete readbacks sometimes disappear. In this case, if the King Air had clearly said runway 28, maybe it would have woken up the JetBlue pilots. But we're straight in 28 right now, simply didn't have that effect. 53:17. 10 seconds later, the JetBlue co-pilot calls, Hayden traffic, JetBlue 1748 coming off the ramp for runway 10. This means they're leaving the ramp, entering the taxiway, heading to the runway 10 holding point. Unicom responds, JetBlue 1748, multiple aircraft inbound, winds calm, altimeter 30.36. 30.36, JetBlue 1748. Note that Unicom only said multiple inbound, didn't specify for which runway. At this exact moment, while doing the after-start checklist, the King Air calls again. 350 Juliet, 12 miles final, 28 straight in Hayden Yampa Valley. Again without saying runway. And again the call happens while the JetBlue pilots are busy with something else. A few seconds later, the co-pilot asks the captain, We're number 1. Want to do anything else first? He's asking if he should call Denver now and report they're almost ready, but the captain responds, I think we better wait for those planes to land first. Look how interesting this is. Shows good judgment from both pilots. They believe that everyone is coming to runway 10, the same one they're going to use. So it makes perfect sense to wait for the landings before taking off, right? Here comes a super important concept I need to explain to you, expectation bias. It's a powerful psychological phenomenon where the expectation you have about a situation heavily influences what you hear and how you interpret information. In this case, both JetBlue pilots formed early a mental picture of the traffic flow. Multiple aircraft inbound to runway 10, and since there was no controller at the airport, they missed the King Air's calls saying he had changed to 28. And now comes the part that, without this psychological explanation, makes no sense whatsoever, because the two aircraft are going to start talking directly to each other. King Air on frequency. Anybody about to depart 10 at Hayden? JetBlue captain. JetBlue 1748 is going to hold short of runway 10 at the end of the runway, waiting for our clearance. King Air. All right, we are on a 10-mile final, 28 straight in. JetBlue captain. All right, copy that, we'll keep an eye out for you. King Air. Thanks. Look at this, my friend. Look carefully. The King Air said clearly, final 28. How the hell did the JetBlue pilots not catch this? Expectation bias. Although the King Air said 28, he still wasn't using the word runway. And because the JetBlue pilots were so convinced he was coming to 10, the information simply didn't register in their brains. In the cockpit, they even comment, all right, so he's coming in now, both expecting to see the King Air appear on the right side any moment. Then they begin the before takeoff checklist, where they verbalize the V speeds, 142, 142, 143. They verify these speeds are properly configured in the FMC on the screens and on the mode control panel. Checklist complete. Now the co-pilot calls Denver as promised. Denver JetBlue 1748, number 1 at runway 10, ready for departure. Denver controller asks, confirm fully ready. Affirmative. JetBlue 1748, cleared from Hayden to Fort Lauderdale as filed. Climb and maintain 13,000. Squawk 0622, Released. Clearance void if not off in 2 minutes. Void time. This is specific to airports without towers. Since there's no local controller to give takeoff clearance, it's up to the pilots to verify the runway is clear and simply take off. But to maintain some control of this, Denver gives a 2-minute window. If they don't take off by then, they need to request a new clearance. And here another piece of the puzzle falls into place because now the pilots feel urgency. Nobody wants to miss the void time. It's not a disaster if it happens, but nobody wants it. So they speed everything up. They quickly finish reviewing the departure route, complete the before takeoff checklist. Both look to the right, searching for the traffic they expect to see on final for runway 10. They see nothing, not through the window, not on the TCAS on the navigation display. So they conclude, the inbound traffic must be really slow, so there'll be plenty of time to take off before it becomes a problem. Let me explain something here. When there's no traffic control, landing traffic has priority over traffic on the ground. The JetBlue pilots knew this. That's why they wanted to get out fast so they wouldn't be in the way of whoever was arriving. Another thing, TCAS has several restrictions when you're on the ground or very low. All oral warnings are inhibited on the ground. Traffic advisories are inhibited up to 600 feet. Resolution advisories are inhibited up to 100 feet. This is to prevent pilots from making abrupt maneuvers near the ground, but TCAS still shows traffic symbols on the navigation display. If the pilots had increased the scale and looked to the other side of the runway, they would have seen the approaching King Air. But they didn't do that. So they continue with departure procedures. Notify flight attendants to be seated. Aircraft enters the runway. 11:54:32. The co-pilot transmits on CTAF. Hayden traffic JetBlue 1748 released, and we're taking off runway 10. Imagine the shock in the King Air cockpit. This pilot thinks he's been super clear about where he is and what he's doing. Made at least 3 position reports, including direct communication with JetBlue. Within 5 seconds, the King Air responds urgently. Hayden Yampa Valley, you got a King Air on final 28. Hayden Yampa Valley, we have been calling. You'd think that would finally wake up the JetBlue pilots. But no. In the Airbus cockpit, the two discuss the position of the calling aircraft. But the expectation bias is so strong that it simply doesn't register he's straight ahead of them. Co-pilot calls back, yeah, I thought you guys were still like 8-9 miles out. King Air, 4 miles. His wife shouts, less than that. Look, if the JetBlue pilots had understood they were talking to an aircraft landing straight ahead of them on the other side of the runway, they would have simply held position or even taxied off again. But that didn't happen. Instead, the captain just tells his colleague, well, we're taking off now. The co-pilot transmits, and JetBlue is on the roll, JetBlue 1748 on the roll, runway 10 Hayden. The King Air responds with a chilling phrase, all right, we're on short final. I hope you don't hit us. If there's one call that should have gotten JetBlue's attention, it was this. Because in their minds they were speeding up the departure to get out of the way of the aircraft they thought was behind them. But an aircraft behind wouldn't say, I hope you don't hit us. They'd say, I hope I don't hit you, you understand? And another question, why didn't the King Air, who clearly understood what was happening, go around? Think about it with me. A commercial jet taking off will be airborne around the middle of the runway and climb fast. The King Air, who's planning to touch down in the touchdown zone on the other side, would theoretically be out of the Airbus's way, if everything went right. But if he went around and started climbing, he'd be at a higher altitude further down the runway and could have a head-on collision with the Airbus. On the other hand, he could have broken off and entered a visual pattern for the downwind of runway 10. But this is something a pilot should never have to consider. I can't even imagine what went through his head when he heard JetBlue was taking off straight toward him. In the Airbus, everything proceeds normally initially. Captain increases engine power, pushes the thrust levers to TOGA, maximum engine power, probably full thrust because of the airport's high elevation. The 2 jet engines roar at full power and begin to accelerate the plane down the runway. Co-pilot, airspeed alive. The speed tape started moving. 7 seconds later, he's on 28? Captain, is he? Oh shit. Co-pilot, 80 knots, power set. You know what happened? The co-pilot did the normal scan of instruments and saw a TCAS target straight ahead, in the takeoff direction. This was before the 80-knot call. So the correct thing here would be for the captain to execute a low-speed rejected takeoff and exit the runway. But that's not what happened. Both begin looking through the windows, trying to visually identify the aircraft. But they're trying to see a mostly white aircraft against a background of white snow-covered mountains with a thin cloud layer. They can't see anything. Meanwhile, the Airbus continues accelerating with each passing second, making the decision to reject harder and harder. The pilots continue discussing whether they can see the traffic. Neither of them can. The King Air comes on frequency again. You guys do a quick turnout in case we're... is interrupted by another transmission, probably from the JetBlue co-pilot responding, "Yes, sir." Maybe that last transmission gave the captain what he needed to make a decision. Rejecting the takeoff would be the most sensible thing, and could be done all the way to V1, since this was clearly a situation of an aircraft unsafe to fly. But facing a situation he'd probably never seen before, with all the stress and shock that causes, it's possible the captain was temporarily overwhelmed and that the mention of turnout took over his head. Either way, when that transmission happens, he just responds, "Oh, Jesus Christ," and starts pulling the stick. This happens as the aircraft passes 118 knots, 24 knots before the calculated rotation speed. Because of this, the co-pilot shouts, "You're slow! Airspeed, 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 airspeed!" But the aircraft's nose has already started rising and is going to a higher and higher angle. Let me explain how rotation speed is calculated. It uses aircraft performance data combined with weight, temperature, pressure, and other things to determine when the plane will be able to safely take off and continue flying with required margins. If you rotate before that speed, there won't be enough air flowing over the wings to effectively lift the aircraft. Which means that unless you stop the rotation, the plane will just increase the nose angle until eventually its tail scrapes the ground, which happens at about 11.7 degrees if the main gear is compressed. And that's exactly what happened now. As the aircraft passes between taxiways Alpha 5 and Alpha 4, well before the runway midpoint, a security camera on the ramp records the aircraft struggling to get airborne and the eventual tail strike. In the cockpit, the pilots feel a strong bump as the tail touches the ground. It was much more pronounced and violent than they thought a tail strike would feel like. The aircraft then slowly gets airborne. The captain lowers the nose to let the speed start building up. Co-pilot, "Positive rate," and raises the gear while the captain shouts, "What the beep was that?" His colleague responds, "I think it may have been the tail." But now they have other things to think about because the King Air is just 2.3 nautical miles ahead of them, approaching fast. And as I explained before, TCAS won't give resolution advisories this close to the ground. So the captain quickly starts turning right to avoid the oncoming traffic while the King Air makes an unintelligible call on the frequency. JetBlue co-pilot responds, "JetBlue's making the turn." King Air finally responds, "Yep, thank you." He's now on very short final, and since he can see the Airbus turning away in front of him, he decides to just continue and land. After he's safely on the ground, the King Air taxis to the ramp and calls Denver, asking about the best way to report this incident. He must have been quite upset by the whole ordeal. But this story is far from over. In the JetBlue cockpit, the pilots continue normal procedures, retracting flaps and completing the after-takeoff checklist. At the same time, they're obviously discussing what they just went through. Both agree they were certain the other aircraft was on final for runway 10. The co-pilot also points out the captain rotated way too early, and the captain agrees. He says he'll write the tail strike in the aircraft's logbook when they land in Fort Lauderdale. While this discussion is happening, Denver calls them first without getting an answer. But when he tries again asking about flight altitude, the co-pilot responds, "JetBlue 1748, we're 10,100 climbing to 13,000 off Hayden," without mentioning one word about what had just happened. The controller responds that he has radar contact and they need to maintain 13,000 because of traffic, a Hawker maintaining 14,000 straight ahead of them. This gives the pilots more time to discuss what they just went through, and that includes again pointing out how sure they were about the King Air being on runway 10, but also how they felt the Unicom operator should have told them the traffic was actually coming on runway 28. Obviously that would have helped, but the Unicom operator had no such obligation. And considering the two pilots were clearly talking to each other, and the King Air had repeatedly pointed out he was coming on 28, That operator probably thought it was more than enough. The pilots also discuss how they thought the King Air was on an IFR flight plan and how he should have been brought to 10 by Denver Control. But all those points were moot now. This type of discussion is very typical after a traumatic event, where the involved parties try to find a way to explain and rationalize their own actions. It's very human, but what that discussion failed to realize is that now they had another very real problem, because there's no way for a pilot in the cockpit to assess how badly damaged their aircraft is after a tail strike like this. Yes, the damage could cause pressurization issues that would give warnings, but even if that's not the case, there might still be substantial structural damage that doesn't give any warnings at all. First, extreme expectation bias. The pilots formed early a mental picture that all inbound traffic was for runway 10. Once that picture was formed, every new piece of information was filtered through that lens. When the King Air said 28, their brains simply didn't process it as opposite runway. Can you believe that? It's as if the brain had decided he could only be coming to 10 and ignored any contrary evidence. Second, non-standard phraseology. The King Air never used the word runway in any of his calls. It was always 10 or 28. And although it might seem obvious to people at home watching, for a busy pilot, certain words work as attention triggers. Runway 28 or runway 28 has a different weight in our heads than simply 28. Can you believe this small difference may have contributed to the disaster? Third, void time pressure. When Denver gave that clearance with void, if not off in 2 minutes, that created artificial urgency. The pilots didn't want to miss that void time. It wouldn't be a disaster, but nobody wants it. So they rushed everything: checklist, route review, departure preparation. And in that rush, they didn't dedicate enough attention to really process what was being said on the frequencies. Fourth, communication system complexity. 2 simultaneous frequencies, CTAF and Denver Center. The King Air's crucial plan change happened on the Denver frequency, while JetBlue pilots were busy starting the second engine. The first call on CTAF about runway 28 happened while they prepared to taxi. It's a system that can work well with low volume, but Hayden had 30 movements per day, including commercial jets. You know what's worse? This was documented in JetBlue's special briefing as a known risk. Fifth, lack of structured decision-making training. When the tail strike happened, the pilots never used any structured decision-making model. PIOC, foredeck, whatever. They did some of the steps, checked pressurization on the after-takeoff checklist. When they saw it was working normally, they assumed tail strike was no big deal. But there existed a specific tail strike checklist in the QRH that they never consulted. And you know what that checklist said? Land as soon as possible. Maximum altitude 10,000 feet or MSA. Rate of climb 500 feet per minute. Don't pressurize the aircraft. And what did they do? Accepted climbing to FL 230, then FL 260, FL 310, FL 350, pressurizing more and more the balloon that may have been weakened by the tail strike. Look at the irony. The minimum MORA there was 16,600 feet. They had to climb up to there anyway. But they shouldn't have accepted anything above that without first consulting the QRH. And here's the question I ask you. Is this a training problem? Because in my view, the fact they didn't go to the QRH after a tail strike so violent that it threw passengers' belongings to the floor points to a serious gap in training. So what did the industry learn from all this? JetBlue, since this incident, has been working with instructors to give better guidance on how to safely operate from untowered airports, how to deal with unannounced failures like tail strikes, and general QRH procedures. But there are bigger questions here. Airports like Hayden, with significant mix of commercial aviation, air taxi, and general aviation without control tower in mountainous area, are they safe enough? Or do we need to rethink how we operate in these places? And there's another question that bothers me. The Airbus and Boeing 2 tail strike checklist isn't clear about what to do if you're already at altitude when you notice the damage. The checklist assumes you'll identify immediately and execute before climbing. But what if that's not the case? Do you depressurize the aircraft at altitude, forcing an emergency descent? Or do you make a gentle pressurized descent down to below 10,000 feet and then depressurize gently? If you're an aircraft structural engineer, I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments down below. The King Air reported the incident appropriately. No action was taken against him, and shouldn't be because he did everything right, called his positions multiple times, tried direct communication, was clear about his intentions. What about the JetBlue pilots? I have no information about what happened to them, but I hope they received extra training and returned to the line. Because that's how just culture should work, my friend. People shouldn't be punished for honest mistakes, especially after reporting them accurately. I'm going to leave you with a reflection. Modern aviation is incredibly safe because of the layers of protection we've built. But all those layers depend on one thing: human attention, clear communication, and humility to admit when we're not sure. That day in Hayden, multiple layers failed. But in the end, what almost caused a head-on collision between two planes on a runway was something happening inside the pilots' heads: expectation bias. It's a silent enemy we all face, inside and outside the cockpit. Next time you're absolutely certain about something, stop for a second. Ask yourself, am I seeing what's really here? Or am I seeing what I expect to be here? It might save your life. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to leave that like and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, do you think airports with this volume of commercial traffic should have mandatory control towers? Or does the current system work well as long as everyone does their part? This is Captain Sergio Marchetti. Thank you for being my co-pilot on this investigation. See you on the next flight.